John William King's Final Hours. Inside the hate crime that changed America forever. On a quiet night in April 2019, inside the red brick walls of the Huntsville Unit in Texas, John William King took his final walk. His name was already written in history, not for greatness, but for one of the most shocking crimes of the late 20th century. Alongside two other men, he dragged James Byrd Jr. to his death in a crime so brutal, it shook the conscience of America and exposed wounds the nation thought had healed. Decades later, King faced the punishment the state had prepared for him, strapped to a gurney, silent, offering no last words. But what really happened in his final 24 hours? What did he eat? What did he say or refuse to say? And what legacy did his execution leave behind? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling last chapter of John William King. And if you love real-life prison documentaries, subscribe now to never miss a story. Dear friends, when John William King woke up on April 24, 2019, he knew the day had finally arrived. For 2 decades, he had been caged inside Texas's Polunsky Unit on death row. 2 decades of appeals, protests, delays, and headlines. But now, there was no more running from the past, no more legal loopholes. The state of Texas was ready, and the Huntsville Unit stood waiting just 45 miles away, the place where so many executions before his had been carried out, and where King would soon breathe his last. At 6 o'clock in the morning, guards entered his cell. The process was standard, almost mechanical, but the weight of the moment hung in the air. King was given a final shower and a set of clean white prison clothes. He was shackled at the wrists and ankles before being loaded into a van for the short drive to Huntsville. With every mile, the end drew closer. Outside the prison walls, protesters gathered, some calling for justice for James Byrd Jr., others questioning whether the death penalty itself had any place in modern America. Inside, it was silent. To understand why Texas pursued this execution with such determination, we have to revisit that night in Jasper, Texas, June 7, 1998. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old black man, was walking home after a party. He was less than a mile from his front door when a pickup truck pulled up. Inside were 3 white men, Lawrence Brewer, Sean Berry, and John William King. Byrd accepted the offer of a ride, not knowing it was the last decision of his life. The men drove him to a secluded road where they beat him viciously. They spray-painted his face, mocked him, and urinated on him. Then, in one of the most horrifying hate crimes in American history, they chained his ankles to the back of the pickup and dragged him for nearly 3 miles down a rough asphalt road. Byrd was alive through most of it, his body scraping against the pavement until he was finally decapitated by a culvert. His killers dumped what was left of his body in front of a black church before going home to eat barbecue. The crime made international headlines. It exposed the raw, festering presence of racial hatred in America. And it reminded the world that lynching was not just history, it was still alive. Within days, the 3 men were arrested, and Texas promised justice. John William King was just 23 years old at the time of the killing, but his life had already taken a dark turn. Raised in Jasper, he fell into crime early and was imprisoned at 19 for burglary. While behind bars, he was recruited by a white supremacist gang. His skin became a canvas of hate, swastikas, Confederate flags, slogans of white power, and the most chilling of all, a tattoo depicting a black man hanging from a tree. By the time of his trial in 1999, King showed no remorse. Prosecutors presented letters and drawings where he bragged about igniting a race war. He called himself a soldier and promised that even if he was executed, his actions would inspire others. The jury didn't hesitate. It took only 2 hours to convict him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. 2 years later, Lawrence Brewer would also receive the death penalty, while Sean Berry, the 3rd man, was given life in prison for his role as the driver. For the next 20 years, John William King lived under the fluorescent lights of death row at the Polunsky Unit. He spent 23 hours a day locked in a tiny cell, with only 1 hour for recreation in a small outdoor cage. His appeals went on for years, but one by one, they were denied. He argued that his trial had been flawed, that his lawyer had failed to present evidence that might have spared him, but the courts weren't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. His words, his tattoos, and the blood on his clothes spoke louder than any appeal could. Through those years, James Byrd Jr.'s family waited. They attended hearings, spoke to the press, and carried the heavy burden of grief. Byrd's sister, Clara Taylor, once said, "We don't want revenge. We want justice. And we want the world to remember James not just how he died, but how he lived." When the sun rose on April 24th, 2019, King was transferred to Huntsville. He was placed on death watch, under constant observation. Unlike many inmates before him, he did not get to choose a last meal. Years earlier, after his co-defendant Lawrence Brewer had ordered a lavish feast and then refused to eat it, Texas abolished the tradition. King was given the standard tray of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a roll. He barely touched it. As the day went on, the atmosphere outside the prison grew tense. Supporters of the Byrd family gathered in prayer, holding candles and pictures of James. Protesters of the death penalty stood across the street, holding signs that read, "Justice is not killing," and "Stop executions now." Media vans broadcast live updates, waiting for the clock to strike. Inside, King had no visitors. No family came. No friends called. He spent the last hours of his life in silence, unrepentant. Guards later said he appeared calm, cold, and detached, as if he had already resigned himself to fate. At 6:56 in the evening, John William King was led into the execution chamber. He was strapped onto the gurney, arms outstretched under the bright white lights. Behind the glass, witnesses filed in, journalists, state officials, and members of James Byrd Jr.'s family. The warden leaned over and asked the traditional question, "Do you have any last words?" King's response was simple. He shook his head. He had nothing to say, no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the pain his actions had caused. At 7:04 in the evening, a lethal dose of pentobarbital was injected into his veins. For a few minutes, his chest rose and fell. His eyes closed. At 7:08 in the evening, John William King was pronounced dead. From the witness room, Clara Taylor whispered a prayer. Outside, Byrd's son Ross reflected quietly. Years earlier, he had shocked many by publicly forgiving his father's killers. For him, the execution was not about revenge, but about ensuring the world remembered James's story. The murder of James Byrd Jr. did more than shock America. It changed the law. In 2009, the federal government passed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, expanding hate crime protections nationwide. James's name, tied forever to tragedy, became a symbol of the fight against racial violence and bigotry. For Jasper, Texas, the crime left scars that never fully healed. The road where Byrd was dragged was renamed James Byrd Jr. Memorial Drive. Memorials were built, and every June, his family and community gathered to honor his memory. But for them, justice was never about the executions. It was about ensuring no other family would suffer the way they did. According to the FBI's most recent data, in 2023, there were more than 11,800 hate crime incidents reported across the country. Of those, the most common motivation was based on race, ethnicity, or ancestry, making up just over 51% of all reported incidents. Anti-Black or African American incidents accounted for more than half of these race-based crimes. Religious bias was the second most common motivation, followed by sexual orientation.